Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Cult Vault. I'm your speaker, Casey, and for this instalment, I have another interview. This time, an episode with a slightly different theme. We often speak of cults and the detrimental effect they have on people's lives. The evidence cannot be disputed, especially when it's coming firsthand from survivors of these movements. However, what about those who venture into movements knowing that they are cults, but willingly tag along because the way that they have experienced the sect has been overall positive? This week I speak with Jess about her time within the new Kadampa Tradition, where she had this type of experience. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you all that you can support my Patreon for as little as £1 a month at patreon.com/thecultvault. There are exclusive episodes waiting for you. But for now, here is Jess. So hi Jess, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk today.
I'm excited for our listeners to hear about this movement because it's not one that I've heard of before until we began our email exchange. So would you like to start by introducing yourself and telling the listeners a little bit about where you are and what you're up to?
Sure. So I'm a student at a university in New Jersey. I'm about 8 months away from earning my degree in history.
Awesome. And is that something that you've always been interested in?
Yeah, for sure. I feel super lucky to be studying where I am, and I've really enjoyed my education so far.
And what are your plans post-degree?
I haven't quite figured it out yet. I think I may go into teaching.
That would be great. That would be great. The world always needs more teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're here to talk specifically about your work experience in 2018.
Yeah, so I stayed in the Kadampa Meditation Center. They have a few centers throughout the world and throughout the US. I was staying at the one in the Catskills. I think it's Glen Spey, New York. So I went there for about a week on a work exchange in 2018, and while I was there, I slowly realized that I was an adult.
So what is the official name of this movement?
So sorry, I forgot to clarify. They're called the New Kadampa Tradition.
All right, okay. And is work experience common for this movement? Do they have a lot of people going along for work experience?
So when I was there were maybe 6 or 7 other volunteers with me who were in the same boat as I was, where they were just there for the week. A lot of them were from out of the country, where they just wanted somewhere to stay and work in the US. So they seem to attract a lot of foreigners. But yeah, that's how they get a lot of their manual labor done, is by they have this work exchange program where they invite people to stay with them in exchange. So in exchange for work, they'll provide you with a bed, a warm meal every day, and things like that.
Okay. So what are the core beliefs and teachings of the new Kadampa tradition?
So while I was there, they placed a lot of emphasis on personal happiness and inner peace. So like the first session I ever attended there was about world peace and how world peace can be obtained by achieving inner peace first. So just very, almost like if you've studied traditional Buddhism, it's almost like a watered down pop culture version, where it's just about happiness and peace.
Okay. And what was your first impression when you arrived?
My first impression when I arrived was, this is the coolest place I've ever been. I'm going to be enlightened here. I remember as I was pulling into the place, I had gotten lost because there was no cell service within like a few miles of where they were. So when I finally found it at the end of this little like dirt road with no cell service, I saw a mother bear and her cubs run across the road.
Wow.
And I just, oh my God, like this place is magical. I can already tell. And I saw that there was no cell service and I loved it. I thought I'm going to be so like disconnected from my devices. And then I met the nuns who were really nice to me. And then I met the other people who were there on the work exchange. So my impressions on the first day that I showed up were overwhelmingly positive. I went to a service and then I had lunch, and I was so excited to start my week working for them.
And what age were you at this time?
I was 18. So I was the youngest person there on the work exchange. Everybody else was around 22, 23, recent college graduates mostly.
And did you drive there yourself?
I did.
Okay, so you didn't have your parents take you along.
No, I said, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to stay at a temple for a week. I'll see you next Sunday," and that was that.
How did you hear about this work experience opportunity?
So this is actually really bizarre. I had a friend who had stayed at a few temples, and we had a conversation, and he suggested a temple to me. And I looked it up, and I found the NKT website, and I was fully under the impression that it was the temple that he had recommended to me. Because whatever temple he told me the name of, when I looked it up, it brought me to this temple's website. So I heard about it through a friend who recommended it to me. But then I found out years later that he had never heard of this place. So it was like a Google search gone wrong that brought me there.
Right, okay. So when you went to compare notes with your friend post visit to this place, your experiences were very different.
Yeah, we had been to completely different places. And I guess I just somehow ended up here. I do know I was woofing at the time, which is it's like a work exchange program similar to what I described, where you give labor in return for like a bed and more meals. And I do know that this host, they were a workaway host, which is a really similar platform as Woof. So that's how everybody who I was with had found it through Workaway, which I think is the most common way that they would like recruit working visitors.
Right, okay. And the NKT itself, is there a particular leader of this movement, or is it just a place that has no particular physical person to worship, but more deities instead?
Yeah, so there is a leader. He has a more formal name. It's like Kelsang. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. It's something like Kelsang Gyatso, but we all called him Geshe-la at the temple, which was his like affectionate nickname. So I never learned his like teacher name. It was just everybody called him Geshe-la. And he doesn't live at the temple. So like I said before, there are temples throughout the world. I think there are two main temples in the United States. There's or maybe three. There's one in Arizona and I think two in New York State. And then they have a few like meditation centers throughout the country. They have some massive temples in like Europe. So I'm not sure where he lives, but he doesn't live at the temple that I was staying at. But his presence was still really tangible. And I'm not sure how many people there have actually like even met him, but there were still like shrines to him everywhere. But I guess we can get into that later if that's coming up.
Yeah, I was going to mention something about the gift shop and library that you spoke about over your emails.
Yes. So that was really strange. I don't know how common it is that a place of worship has a built-in gift shop and cafe. I thought that was kind of funny. There was this massive temple on the grounds, and it was like the main building there. So you walk in, and if you go straight, there is this like really ornate worship room with all of these like golden statues in it. And then to the right, there is a gift shop. To the left, there's a cafe where they sell like vegan cookies. But in the gift shop, they have all of the books that they sell are written by Geshe-la. They don't sell anything from any other Buddhist author. And I also noticed when I was on my work exchange, I would sometimes enter the homes of the other people who lived there. And they all had these bookshelves that were just full of books by Geshe-la. My whole stay there, I saw hundreds of books, and there wasn't a single one written by anyone besides Geshe-la, except I did see like a glass case that had text from the Pali Canon in it, which is a Buddhist text. And that was the only time I saw any book that was not written by Geshe-la.
Right. So would it be right to assume that other texts weren't allowed on site?
Yeah, so nobody ever said anything like that to me, but I did, after I realized I was staying at a cult, I read through some testimonies from cult survivors, and they said that they weren't allowed to have any books that weren't written by Geshe-la. So, and I kind of feel that I had a little bit of like preferential or special treatment because I was a working visitor, but I think if I had lived there, I probably wouldn't have been allowed to have other books.
Right. Okay. And how long was your work experience going to last for?
It was 7 days.
It
So
was 7 days.
it was 5 days of work and 2 days of do whatever I want around the temple.
Okay. And what was expected of you in those 7 days overall?
Um, so the one that I remember most vividly is we had to put in a parking lot for them. It was made of this like Lego like plastic material, but it was most like back-breaking, grueling work. Because we were putting it over like a gravel parking lot, and we had these wooden planks where each of the volunteers, like one of us, would get on each side, and we had to run across the whole parking lot with this like wooden plank in our hand to even out the gravel so that we could snap the pieces of the parking lot into place. So it was a lot of manual labor like that. I painted some fences and like bench posts for them. If can I interject a story actually that happened while I was doing that?
Yes, absolutely.
So the volunteer coordinator one morning told me that my job would be painting the benches by the temple. So I took my paint and I went in front of the temple and I painted these old benches where all the paint was peeling off. And I went up to him when I was done and I told him that I had finished the work. And he looked at me and he said, "That was really fast. Which benches did you paint?" And my heart sank and I thought, oh my God, I painted the wrong benches. So I took him over to them and he looked at me and he said, okay, these weren't the benches you were supposed to paint, but everybody is going to be so happy that these old benches finally got painted. And it was so, I like that really stood out to me because I was so expecting to be in trouble. Um, but he was just so accepting and so quickly able to turn it into a positive experience. And I told some of the other working visitors about it later that day. And we had a conversation about how that man's voice was so gentle and soothing that we would probably do anything he asked us to. And I remember one of the volunteers, they were imitating him, and she said, like, oh, why don't you just go jump off that cliff? And if he asked me to do it, I would probably do it. So in hindsight, I think it's really funny that we noticed so quickly how charismatic and kind he was. And just he had such a profound impact on me when I put like I painted furniture that I wasn't supposed to paint. And he so quickly just the way that he was so accepting really like drew me in and made me think, wow, this is a really special place where everybody here is so kind.
And did he show you the benches that you were supposed to paint after
I did.
this?
I I had somebody help me finish painting those too, so they did
Right.
get painted.
Okay. And what kind of behavior was expected from you whilst you were staying at this place?
Um, it I can't say that anybody ever sat me down and told me there was a specific way I was supposed to act. It's certainly some degree of being social was expected. Nobody ever ate lunch alone. So the nuns would make this big lunch every day, and whatever table you sat at, somebody was always going to come sit with you, and you would be expected to make conversation with them. But it didn't really feel like a chore to me. It felt like this is great. I love that these people want to talk to me. Like they're so cool and they have taken interest in my life. We were expected to give 8 hours of labor a day. And then there would be temple services in the evening, which we weren't required to attend, but there wasn't really much else to do. Um, some people would be doing silent retreats. So you would like walk up to somebody and then you start talking to them and they like flash this sign at you that says like on silent retreat, I can't talk. So I guess that was like a social norm is like you need to watch who you start talking to because it's like you don't want to talk to somebody who's like on a silent retreat. Um, but I don't think we had any super rigorous expectations. Everybody there was really kind, and just thankful that we were doing work for them. So I woke up, I did my work, I went to temple in the evening.
And what did you decide to do with the 2 days of free time that you had?
Um, I had a wonderful time that Saturday. So there were it was like a Sunday to Sunday visit. So my 2 days of free time were Saturday and Sunday. Um, and I went to a temple service in the morning on Saturday. And then there's this plant called mugwort that's mildly psychoactive, and it's just like a weed that happens to be psychoactive that I found growing around the temple. So I picked a bunch of it and I laid it on the roof of my car. And I got like two or three of the working visitors together, and I was like, "Hey, let's go somewhere and smoke this mugwort." Um, and then we found these two women who were living at the temple told us about their secret swimming hole. So the mugwort, it was really hot that day. So it dried out on my car really quickly. So then I took me and these two other volunteers. I took them down to this secret swimming hole that we had been given directions to. One of them bought like a bottle of wine. We bought like rolling papers to smoke the mugwort, and we went down to the river and we drank the wine and we smoked our mugwort. And then those two women showed up, and the water I remember was so like freezing cold that I didn't want to. None of us wanted to touch it. It was just like too cold to swim in. And then the women who lived in the temple showed up and they jumped right in and encouraged us to come in with them. And so I did. We all got in the water and we dunked our heads in together. And I swear it was like a baptism. It was, and I know that's such a dramatic thing to say about going swimming, but just finding these women who were so like casual about doing something like it hurts when you swim in water that's that cold.
Mm-hmm.
But after they showed up, we just swam around and it felt amazing. And for a long time after that, even to this day, like I love jumping in cold water because it just reminds me of that day and those women who were so like excited to do it. And then I hiked the temple was on like hundreds of acres of forest or something like that. So we hiked around a little bit around the temple grounds. And I think that's about all that I did. They took us to a service they had in New Jersey, which was about an hour drive. So they took us to one of their other meditation centers, and we did like a group meditation with some like townspeople who weren't explicitly members of the temple. We went out to lunch. I think that's about all that we did. So it was a really full day and it was really fun on the days that we weren't working.
It sounds like the experience at the waterhole was quite bonding, like almost as if you're all going to do this exciting and scary thing together, and then when you finally do it and you push yourself to do something that you were afraid to do, it sounds like it's quite euphoric.
Yeah, for sure. It was a really magical few days that I spent there. And every day it had that same tone to it where it felt like I'm pushing my body so hard, but I'm so lucky that I get to be here.
And what was the living situation like?
So I stayed in this building called the Barn. It wasn't really a barn. It was basically like a small house. There was a shared kitchen downstairs. Um, and then I stayed in the women's dormitory, which was maybe six or seven bunk beds shoved together into one room. So there were maybe like eight other women in the room with me. and then the men's dormitory was on the other side, and then downstairs there were a few permanent residents living there. There were a few really elderly women living there. So it was a mix of volunteers and permanent residents. They had the books written by Geshe Law on the inside. There were also shrines to Geshe Law throughout the house. I don't believe that there were any in our dormitory room. But like I entered an elderly woman's room one time. For some reason, I had been invited inside, and she had like a shrine to Geshe Law next to her bed. There were fridge magnets with his picture on them. There were photos of him in the hallway, like any nook and cranny that you could fit a picture into, there was a picture of him hanging. But we had clean living situations. We were on bunk beds, but it was comfortable. We had a clean bathroom that we shared. So the barn that we stayed in was the only part of the entire temple that had Wi-Fi. So I couldn't call anybody. If I wanted to like check my email, I could do it as long as the Wi-Fi was up, which in hindsight, it made me scared to realize that, because since there's no cell service, somebody just has to unplug the router and we're completely closed off from the outside world. And there was also like a giant gate outside of the temple. And in hindsight, I realized that if somebody had closed the gate and unplugged the router, we just would have been stuck there with no way of contacting anybody. So that is a little bit weird to look back on. But I found the living situation comfortable, if a bit crowded.
And you mentioned the volunteer coordinator before as well. What was his living situation?
Yeah, so he, as far as I know, I mean, I'm sure some of like the head monks had their own quarters. I didn't see where the monks lived. But he was the only person I met who had his own quarters. He lived in this very small trailer outside of, there were a few houses throughout the temple grounds. He lived outside of a house in this like one room trailer. And his job, he was the one I talked about before, who was just so kind to everybody. His job was he woke up at like 5 or 6 in the morning. He came and he met the working visitors and he told us what kind of manual labor that he needed done, and he did it with us. And that was this guy's whole life, was like 5 days a week. He wakes up at 6 o'clock in the morning and just does unpaid labor with a bunch of volunteers.
Right. And you mentioned nuns and monks as well. What's their appearance like, and what is their role within the temple?
Yeah, so they wore traditional like Buddhist garments. They wore these long red robes. The nuns had their heads shaved. The monks had no hair at all. I also noticed that the temple was overwhelmingly white. There were a few monks who were clearly Asian, but all of the permanent residents, all of the nuns, were white, which I think in hindsight probably should have been a red flag, right? If we're following this religious tradition that comes from an Asian country, it kind of shows that it's not widely practiced by, like, the fact that it's a form of Buddhism widely practiced by white people probably should have been a red flag that like this isn't a school of Buddhism that people who are like raised Buddhist are practicing, if that makes sense.
It does. I've just spoken to somebody who talked me through another almost fringe Buddhist tradition that is similar in the way that you're describing it, but there were no nuns and monks as well, which is what I thought was particularly interesting about your story. You spoke about a silent retreat just before. Can you tell the listeners what a silent retreat is and how long it might last for?
So I think some of the people were there for a weekend. I think maybe up to a week people would be there on retreat. So it's basically the same concept as a regular retreat. You go to the temple to meditate and obtain some kind of like spiritual or emotional like cleansing and fulfillment. but you can't speak the whole time you're there. So they just went through the whole week like not uttering a word. And it was always, if you ask, I remember talking with the volunteers, we would be like, oh my God, I accidentally talked to somebody on silent retreat earlier. And it was this like weird thing that you weren't supposed to do.
Okay, so and then they would just that communicate to you that they were on a silent retreat. They didn't like wear a certain color or have a badge or anything
That said silent retreat on it. My understanding is that that is common in other schools of Buddhism. I've never been to a silent retreat at a temple that wasn't the new Kadampa tradition, but it is something I've heard of. But yeah, there was, I think it might have been a group of them that was there together. And they just had these necklaces that they would flash at you if you started
Right.
talking to them. And it was like, oh, I wasn't supposed to be that guy.
And you mentioned as well a couple of temple services that you attended. What does temple service look like within NKT?
So this one is super interesting. There were temple services for residents and temple services for the public, and they looked pretty different from one another. I was allowed to go to the resident services because I was staying there on like a work exchange. So the services that were for the public, I would say were much more palatable or much more. I referenced earlier, like pop culture Buddhism, which is kind of what it was to me. So the public services would be like, I listened to a speech about inner peace, and the guy speaking used like a metaphor from the movie Predator. He had people do like a short song and a short meditation, whereas the services for the residents were much longer meditation sessions. And I remember my first red flag that I saw at this place was I showed up for the resident meditation, and he gave me the prayer book from the public service, and then he gave me another prayer book. It was this red book, and it had some kind of title like Prayers for the Long Life of Our Venerable Founder. And it was a whole book of songs that we had to sing together about there was one called like we request that our glorious founder shall remain forever, and we were praying that he would live forever. And I think that was the one where I was reading it and I was like, oh my God, like this isn't like, I dismissed a lot of my initial concerns as I'm a white American. I'm trying to impose like my Eurocentric understanding of Buddhism onto these people. But then I saw that one and I was like, yeah, I don't think this is a normal school of Buddhism. And the meditation sessions were really, really long, maybe like an hour long sometimes, which is a lot if it's not something that you do every day. And I just remember like sitting there meditating and wanting to run out of the temple because I was so overwhelmed with like the service that I couldn't take it. And I would sometimes open my eyes, and I always went with this girl I was volunteering with, and we would make eye contact sometimes. And while everybody had their eyes closed meditating, we would just quietly get up and walk out of the temple. And nobody knew we were leaving because their eyes were closed because they were meditating.
That sounds creepy.
Yeah, it was bizarre. And so I think we talked over email also about the like the room that we would meditate in, which I can go into detail if you want.
Yes, please. Yes.
So the meditation room, there were maybe like 24 cushions in the front for like seated meditation, and then it was maybe like 50 chairs in the rest of the room. It was this really big open space with like really beautiful architecture. And there were these giant golden Buddha statues at the front of the room. And then there was a chair that the monk giving the service would sit in. And when the monk wasn't sitting there, there would be this giant portrait of Geshe-la sitting on that chair. So like it was a picture of Geshe-la on the chair, and that picture was, does that make sense?
Yeah,
So it was
yeah.
like showing Geshe-la his chair. Um, and then I think it would be like placed onto the ground when the monk was giving the service. But and I also, this is a side thought that may be edited out. I'm just now remembering there was some kind of dome at the top of the building, and I remember being told there was some sacred object had been put inside of it, and I can't for the life of me remember what it was. Um, but it was like when they were constructing the building, they put some sort of sacred object in this dome. I don't think I'm gonna remember because that I like completely blocked that out until now. But anyway, so after my first few days of working there, one of the nuns offered to give us a tour of the temple. And she took us to those giant golden Buddhas that were like in, so if you were sitting down meditating, they would be right in front of you behind the
Okay.
chair. And it took up the whole back wall. There were maybe like 12 to 15 of them.
Wow.
So they like Siddhartha Gautama is like the first Buddha. They had like medicine Buddha, I think is one. There's a Buddha named Tara that they had. And among all of these Buddhas was a giant golden statue of Geshe-la. And the nun told us, so these are all of the statues of the different incarnations of the Buddha. Naturally, Geshe-la was one of them. So if you know anything about Buddhism, the Dalai Lama is considered to be an incarnation of the Buddha. So the implication there is the Dalai Lama is a false prophet. We have the real Dalai Lama. We have the real Buddha. Um, so that was a really that was another red flag where I thought, okay, they think that they have a Buddha as their leader, which was pretty jarring to see, and explained why there was so many like Geshe-la statues and like altars throughout the temple.
And did you ever mention to anybody whether they believed that in the Dalai Lama's teachings?
I heard it come up a few times. So one of the girls I was working with did ask a resident about the Dalai Lama. And I also asked at one point, like what sect of Buddhism is this related to? So there's like Mahayana, Vajrayana, and Theravada.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I asked that, and when the girl asked about the Dalai Lama, the residents just kind of brushed it off and didn't give us a real answer. Um, I can't remember what they said, but they just like deflected in a way that they didn't have to answer the question or talk about the Dalai Lama or talk about what school of Buddhism they were from, which was
Right.
interesting.
And when you traveled to this other temple service in New Jersey, when you said it was full of members of the public who weren't official members of NKT, was this something around recruitment for the movement, or was it just sort of maybe people
Yeah,
just having like taster sessions?
so they did have flyers for like the main temple in the Catskills. And the woman who led the service in New Jersey, I believe she lived at the temple. Um, so it was like this woman from the temple has come to like give her services and her knowledge to all of these non-members. And I mean, I think just the fact that they brought us there, the fact that they brought a large group from the temple to the service, is pretty telling that they were looking to recruit people. Um, I don't remember much about that service. I do remember there was like a socialization component where I talked with some of the like the members of the public who had gone to the service about the work that I was doing there. So yeah, it was like known that there was a larger temple that this small meditation group was representing.
Okay, okay. And what was the food situation like there?
The food situation was fantastic. So breakfast was pretty much fend for yourself. There was a shared kitchen, and the fridge was stocked every week, and we were allowed to eat from it, which was great. They had it was all vegetarian, and they had things like almond milks for like vegans, so they were very accommodating to people's diets. And then for lunch, the nuns would make this huge meal that was all vegetarian. Um, I remember one thing they made that I really liked was an unchicken salad. So it was like a vegetarian version of chicken salad. Um, they had big salads every dinner. They had like a lot of legumes, very like healthy, filling food.
Hmm.
And I believe for dinner they would make it was like a smaller version of lunch. The nuns would cook it. They would have like soups, things like that. And so it was free for the volunteers to eat. And if you weren't a resident, then you had to pay something like $5 or $10 to eat the meal with us.
Right. And is the vegetarianism, I know that many forms of Buddhism focus on, not harming any living creatures. So I'm guessing that vegetarianism is something that is just a rule within NKT.
Yeah, it's pretty common in Buddhism in general. And just compassion for animals in general was something I noticed. There was one day we were working on the parking lot project that I talked about earlier, and we found this dead bird in the bushes. And the volunteer coordinator picked it up. I think he had like gloves on his hand. He picked it up and he went over to the side, and he didn't really like make a show of it. Like he didn't really ask us to participate, but he said a prayer over the bird for like a couple minutes. And then I think he maybe like buried it or threw it in the woods. Um, but yeah, so that idea of I think it's ahimsa. That idea of like not causing harm was present throughout the temple.
And vegetarianism is one thing, but were there any other types of restrictions in place that you were aware of in terms of things like smoking and drinking?
I don't believe you were allowed to have any alcohol or drugs on the property. I certainly didn't see anybody drinking. Um, they asked me, I had to do a survey before I went to work for them where they asked if I had used any drugs in the past year. And I was honest, and I had admitted to a few things like smoking marijuana, eating mushrooms, and they still accepted me. Um, so they certainly weren't like super discriminatory towards the people who came to visit them, but I do believe you weren't allowed to have anything like that on the premises.
Right, okay, okay. And even though there was no phone service and limited internet connection, you were allowed to have your phones with you. And you spoke about a time where one woman had actually lost her phone. Just talk the listeners through that story for us.
Yeah, so I think I came in from working one day and somebody came up to me and said that one of the women who lived there had lost her phone. I believe she actually was living in like some kind of like converted van. Um and she was very poor, they told me. So this woman was running around basically having a panic attack because she couldn't find her phone. Which isn't like a super normal reaction, I don't think, for losing a phone. She was in real distress over it. And I just remember somebody remarking to me, this woman doesn't have any money, like she can't afford to replace her phone. Um, so to me, that kind of told me like, okay, the people who are living here don't have the money to replace a lost phone. Um, I know that if you didn't give work to the temple, there was I don't know if it was like a weekly or monthly fee that you had to pay for living there. But I would assume based on that she had put all of her money into living there, and as a result had nothing left.
That was a question I was going to come to, about whether, you know, people had to pay a subscription to be full-time members if they weren't volunteers, or were permanent members just also expected to join in with things like manual labor to earn their keep almost.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I didn't see anybody doing manual labor besides the volunteer coordinator, and the other volunteers. It seemed that pretty much everybody who lived there was paying to do so. And there were a decent amount of older members, who I would think wouldn't be physically able to work like that. So like I said, a lot of the volunteers were in their early 20s, but the permanent residents, were at least in their 40s, a lot of them. Some of them, I think some of them might have actually worked jobs in the town, but I don't know how all of them financed living there, because I'm sure it's not cheap to do that.
Are there any types of fundraisers in place, or is there a particular way that NKT generates money to keep its movement going?
Yeah, so they had a really the public, I think, had a very good perception of them, and they really did draw in that like white pop culture Buddhist crowd. So like they had one event that happened while I was there was a retreat dinner. So it was a whole retreat weekend, but I remember they had this huge fancy dinner that people on the retreat visit got to go to.
Right.
So those events cost a lot of money. I met like an author who was on retreat there. A lot of the people I met were only there for like the weekend or for a few days, because they were paying to be on retreat. And it was like, if you stay in a tent or you stay in the dormitories, then it's cheap. But they have some private quarters that are just for paid guests. So it's like the more fancy your accommodations, the more it costs to stay there. So I think they generated a lot of money from events like that. And it's a global organization, with a lot of members worldwide. So I'm sure on an organizational level, there's a lot more going on with the funding situation.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned something briefly in one of our emails about devil worshipping as well.
Yeah, so demon worshiping. There's so when the nun was giving us that tour of the temple, she pointed out this. I don't know that he's a god. He's some kind of entity, named Dojri Shugden, who she told me that Dojri Shugden puts bad situations into our lives so that we can resolve past karma and learn the lessons that we need to learn. But when you look this entity up, he is regarded as a demon by every sect of Buddhism except the NKT. So that I don't want to say that that's like wrong, because it seems like it's just a theological disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really interesting how this figure, regarded as a demon by all of Buddhism, there's this one sect that's saying, no, we actually really like him and we worship him and we're going to sell you pictures of him in the gift shop.
So it's kind of like different branches of Christianity that interpret scripture in completely different ways.
Yeah, sure.
And you also mentioned briefly in one of your emails that when you spoke to your family and your therapist about going on this retreat for a week, they were quite hesitant to agree that it was a good idea.
Yeah, so I think with that, that's more of like a personal thing. It is, I think it's pretty commonplace for people involved in certain subcultures to go on these work exchanges. So like my therapist was wary of it, my parents were wary of it, which I think is reasonable. If your kid is going somewhere for a week to do free manual labor, it's kind of a red flag. Um, to me, what was the most significant thing about that is when the members of the temple who I would like eat lunch with were really happy and like almost like they like wanted me to feel like they were like proud that I was working there. And if they would make comments like, your parents must love that instead of partying, you're spending your spring break doing this. And then I would just make comments like, my parents aren't thrilled about it, or my therapist thought that it was a bad idea, and they just had very harsh reactions to it. One of them told me that I had a wicked stepmother. One of them told me that my therapist was racist. So that I think the thing that stands out about that is less the way people in my life reacted to it, but the fact that people in the temple were so ready to condemn the people in my life who were like, hey, it's kind of weird that you want to go work for these people for free.
And you even mentioned the volunteer coordinator said something about his family making a comment to him as well about being a member of NKT.
Yes, I ate lunch with him one day, and we talked about our family's reactions to us doing these things. And he basically told me, I totally get it. My family even thinks that I'm in a cult. And he laughed. And the takeaway from that conversation was like, he was just saying, my family doesn't understand that I'm on this spiritual path, but I know that what I'm doing is right. So yeah, the guy's family like believed that he was in a cult.
And you since have actually labelled this a cult as well. What was the turning point for you to think back to yourself and say, actually, something wasn't quite right?
I do have a little bit of contention with the term cult. I think it's difficult to define that and to distinguish it from like different branches of religion, because I do think it's problematic to say that there is any right way to practice a religion. I will say that the form of Buddhism that this group took was not conventional, and there is a survivor group for this organization. So that was a big red flag to me, where I guess I would say in conversation I would like casually refer to it as a cult. I do think it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Mm-hmm.
But so it was seeing the woman who lost her phone and had no money, seeing really the worship of Geshe-la was the biggest red flag for me. Reading about how the NKT disrupts the Dalai Lama's speaking events because they hate him and think he's a false prophet. The lack of self-service thing I also think is pretty weird. The fact that all these people are living here and don't feel the need to like be able to call people. I think mostly though it's the fact that other people online came out about their negative experiences in the NKT. They talked about financial exploitation was the main thing they talked about. There were a few comments about sexual abuse. A few people said that they had been taught that Geshe-la could teleport and could read your mind. So more than anything that I experienced, it's what I read in survivor groups online that made me think, wow, I was with a really sketchy group.
And was it upon reading one of those in particular where you sat back and thought, wow, I went there for a week and I kind of see what you mean?
Yeah, I don't know that I could think of like a specific story that really resonated with me. I think it was I did notice a few red flags while I was there, and just it was so I figured out that it was a cult while I was there. I had this moment. I think it was either after the prayers for eternal life for Geshe-la or after seeing the golden statue of him. And I remember I like quietly walked back to the barn and up to my dormitory, and I just Googled like new Kadampa tradition cult. And all of these articles popped up. There was like a cult survivor group. There were like a couple of news articles about their protests against the Dalai Lama. I think that was the exact moment I was like, oh my God. And it was funny because I had joked to my friends before going, like, I'm totally going to end up at a cult one day. Like, it's just going to happen. And then it happened. And I thought, like, oh, wow.
Did you go back to your friends and have that conversation once you returned home?
Oh, I texted them while I think I might have said something like, I can't talk while I'm here, but like, I think this place might be a cult. And that was the most that I told them. And then when I returned, I did tell people what happened.
And could you know any main differences between the volunteers and permanent members other than things like temple services being different or the manual labor being different?
So the volunteers were really the only ones who did manual labor. The temple residents, I'm not really sure what they did all day. I know they made us cookies once when we were putting in that driveway. They treated us with a lot of respect. And they were very kind to us. They didn't seem to really have many responsibilities. I think they maybe just like meditated and read books all day. Um, in hindsight, I didn't have very many super deep conversations with them, which I wonder if that was intentional on some level for us not to know a lot about the people who lived there permanently. But they went to all the same services as we did. We were allowed to the resident only services because I guess we were classified as residents for some reason while we were volunteering.
Right.
I did feel like we received a lot of attention. People were just like exceptionally kind and hospitable to us, which maybe the permanent residents I'm sure didn't get because they were already accepted into the group. So maybe we were just given a little bit more than them. There was a time when I volunteered at the retreat dinner. The nuns like snuck me a full plate of food as if it was like this bad thing that they were doing, and they told me not to tell anybody. And I feel like that was meant to make me feel like I'm so special. I get to eat this retreat dinner that other people paid $75 for.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we got more attention than the people who lived there, certainly. But we were allowed to go to all of the same services as them.
And if you were to become a full-time member, you think that you would be treated differently then?
It's really hard for me to say that because I didn't talk in depth with a lot of the full-time members. Um, but I'm sure just the difference in treatment between like a person doing manual labor and a person paying to stay there, I'm sure is different because a lot of them being kind to us centered around like, you're doing so much work for us. We're so grateful that you're putting in this parking lot for us and you're painting these benches for us.
Yeah. And when you were there, what was the average time you would wake up, and what was the time you would go then to bed?
I think I would wake up around 6 or 7. I can't remember if our volunteering started at 6 or 7. I know we woke up pretty early in the morning to start working. And then so we would work straight until like noon, and then we had an hour lunch break. And then we would work until 5. I would go to like a temple service. I think by 9, so anywhere between like 9 to 11 at night, I would be. Oh, I know you're from the UK. I don't know how that translates into standard time, but 9 to 11 at night. So that's like 21 to 23.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I woke up pretty early and I went to bed pretty early.
Okay, so that's okay. That's not too bad, especially when you're doing things that you've talked about. You know, the manual labor. You need the good, nutritious meals for. You need the good amount of sleep. Otherwise, you're not going to be any good to anybody.
Yeah, I honestly think I've done a few work exchanges, and I honestly think the temple is like the best accommodations I've ever had, from like food to my living situation. They took really good care of us.
And you've said during our conversation today, you've said that you had a magical few days, and during the email exchanges, you've said that you were profoundly happy during your week at the NKT temple. So why did you not return?
I really intended to. I left, and the nuns said things like, we hope we see you again one day. And I said, of course, like it's my full intention to be back here. The cult thing really wasn't what deterred me because I figured out it was a cult after 2 or 3 days, and I still kept working there and was having fun.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only reason I didn't come back was like I didn't feel like doing all of that manual labor. And just as a student, I didn't have the time to do it. Mm-hmm. But I actually, a few months ago, before COVID, I did try to go again. And I think the only reason I didn't go was I would be paying for like tent accommodations, and I thought it was too cold. So I decided I didn't want to go again. But there honestly wasn't really anything that made me think like I'm never going to go back there. I felt really safe there, which is maybe naive on my part. Um, but I didn't feel that there was anything like deterring me from coming back.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you've said that you have some contention with the word cult, and you've used it to describe NKT itself, but you're not saying that you think that there's the potential for physical or psychological harm for the members of this movement.
No, I believe people who say that that happened to them. Um, I also think that there are multiple temples throughout the world. So the people who say that they were sexually abused, that could have happened at a temple
Yeah.
in the UK. And I'm also not saying that it doesn't happen at the temple that I was staying at. I can't know that as a volunteer. I only say that I felt safe there, I guess because I was a working visitor. They really rely on their working visitor program to keep their temple running. It's a free source of manual labor, so I think they want to treat those people well and they want them to have good experiences because the second a volunteer says I was abused here, that's going to get shut down immediately.
And
Um,
not only that, if you say, you know, I've really enjoyed my time here, I'm going to come back, and next time I come back, I'll pay to stay here, you know, that's only going to further the progression of the movement.
yeah, of course.
And when you talk about the survival group and some of the testimonies that you've read, where can people find this group?
Um, I think if you just look up New Kadampa Tradition survival group, it'll come up. I know there's a group on Facebook. There might be a website. And I know there's an organization. I think it's called Cult Watch List. So I'm looking this up right now. New Kadampa Tradition Cult is what I just put in. A bunch of articles just came on. It slowly dawned on me that I've been sucked into a cult, the One Pure Dharma. So if you look that up, you'll see results right away. I see one on
Okay.
cult.com.
And how do you think movements, I've asked this question to all of the people that I've been interviewing recently. How do you think movements like NKT will have fared during COVID?
That's a great question. I mean, I would imagine they certainly can't welcome the public. I know some churches had started doing services again. I would hope that they didn't continue doing services. It would probably be illegal for them to do so. Um, I'm sure the permanent residents there who were there for like shorter stays, like I'm sure there are people who were there for like 6 months rather than indefinitely. I'm sure they would have gone home to their families. But that's a really great question. I think of like the nuns, the really old women living there who had nowhere else to go. I'm not sure where they could have gone if they didn't have like family to support them. I haven't heard from anybody in the movement or seen how they're handling COVID. But it is kind of scary. Unless they close themselves out entirely from the outside world, they would have to get a lot of people out of there.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, what you've said there sounds sort of what I was thinking would be the case with NKT itself. A lot of people I've been speaking to recently, notably mostly ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, have said that their religion is based on the end times, you know, the end of the world, the second coming, and all these things that are inevitable within their religion.
Oh wow,
So
yeah.
COVID is I was thinking that it would hinder the recruitment and the fundraising for the Jehovah's Witnesses, because the door-to-door stuff would become, you know, would have to stop for a period of time. But of course, people speaking about the end times and the end of the world, it's scary. Ex-Jehovah's Witnesses are coming back to the fold. And because NKT is not the same in that way, I was just wondering what you thought your of what your take might be on the situation.
Yeah, that's something I probably should have researched that before this call because now I'm very curious about that. I will say about the funding, what you just said made me remember I don't know if this is a conspiracy theory or how valid this is, but I've seen people online arguing that the NKT is funded by some like anti-Tibet group in China. Um, so that's because it is weird that a group like this they clearly have access to a lot of money. They just built the new temple in Arizona like a year or two ago. So if that is true, that there is some larger funding coming out of like a political organization, maybe it would be easier for them to retain stability. Um, but yeah, I honestly don't know how they're handling all of it.
And do you think you'll ever find yourself back at one of these temples?
That's a great question. I have some ethical hangups about giving free manual labor to a place that has such harsh accusations against them. Um, but to be completely honest with you, especially if I end up somewhere like Arizona, where I don't really have anywhere to stay there unless I do a work exchange, I could see myself doing another week there, which I don't know how to feel about it ethically or if it's like naive for me to think that I would be safe there. But I had a really good time there and I could potentially see myself going back because for all of the shit that the organization does as an individual, I found it really great to go stay with them.
Yeah, I mean, you can read testimonies online and you can listen to other people's experiences, but you're only going to understand NKT truly from the experiences that you had, which sound mostly to be on the positive side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I never had a moment there where I felt afraid for my life, or even though the work that we did was really intense, but I never felt like I can't handle this amount of work. Um, and I totally acknowledge that the people living there have completely different experiences from that. But they did treat their volunteers really well.
And I've just got one more question before I offer you to talk about anything you think we've missed.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke at the very beginning of the call about NKT members trying to attain inner peace. How does that happen? How does somebody gain inner peace?
That's a great question. Do you mean in general from the philosophy of the NKT?
Yes.
Um, I one thing that they taught was control over your emotions. The ceremony, or not the ceremony, the temple service that I talked about, where they talked about achieving world peace by achieving inner peace. They talked a lot about controlling your emotions like anger. They had said something like it's like holding on, it's like drinking poison, where the only person that it hurts when you're angry is yourself. um, so to an extent, they drew on traditional Buddhist teachings. Letting go of your desires, letting go of your ego. Um, I guess that's about it. I don't know that they really gave us concrete answers. Maybe because they were trying to sell it to us. Um, but it was mostly like meditation, control over your emotions, accepting hardship, and it's hard to see where the line is between this is a traditional Buddhist teaching and this is a thing that we're teaching members of our group so that they're not angry that they're being mistreated. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, is there anything you think we've missed or anything you'd like to add before we finish our call today?
I think we covered most of what I can remember. It was a really good experience. I don't know if it's a good thing to these groups and to help them function. It probably isn't very ethically just to do so. Um, but yeah, I don't think I have any other anecdotes or anything to add.
No, that's fantastic. You've given a really candid retelling of the 7 days you spent there, and it's interesting to speak to somebody who has had a positive experience, pretty much from start to finish, because most people I speak to, obviously their recounts of them surviving a cult or escaping a cult or being excommunicated and then realizing that they were in a cult that has abused them in some way, whether physically or psychologically. It's not something that seems to have happened to you. So it is refreshing to speak to somebody who can say, there weren't just periods that were positive. The entire thing overall seems to be positive. And obviously that doesn't discredit the negative and abusive experiences of other people who have had run-ins with this cult or this community group or this movement, or however you'd wish to address them. So I've really enjoyed being able to listen to your perspective and just have an uplifting conversation.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for taking the time to interview me. It's fun to reflect about what that week was. And I totally agree with you that I'm very lucky that nothing bad happened to me while I was there. But that certainly doesn't mean that I don't believe bad things do happen to people there.
Absolutely. Okay then, Jess, so I'm going to end the call there. I'm going to say goodbye and just thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, of course, Casey. It was great meeting you. Thank you so much for interviewing me.
Enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you have a great time in New Jersey.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye. That's where we're going to leave today's episode. If you'd like to reach me, you can do so on cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.